But what I'm going to do now is introduce you to our keynote speaker, Jeffrey Toobin, who has a vast bio, including being a CNN commentator. Recently wrote a book called The Pardon, the story of the Nixon pardon, and he probably relate some of that to the current climate of pardons. And just a sensational man who I watch all the time on CNN, and because I'm a CNN junkie, by the way. And every time it comes on now, I go, he's going to speak for us. So without further ado, it is 9:10, and we're going to give the floor to Jeffrey. So Greg, if you could unmute Jeffrey, and we will start it off. So thank you, Jeffrey Toobin. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be with you. I'm a big fan. I'm a big fan of second chances. I've gotten some myself. I've tried to give them whenever I've had the opportunity. And I think your organization is doing a great service, not just to you, the direct beneficiaries, but to all of us, because I think when people come back, we all benefit. America loves a comeback, and I think that's what the Prisonist is all about. And I'm rooting for you and glad to be with you here this morning. I'm going to talk about two things this morning, and they're very different, and they have very different statuses in the world, I guess, if that's the right way to put it. One is very cynical, and the other is very hopeful. So they are very different. And the first thing I want to talk about is pardons. As Jeff said, I just wrote a book called The Pardon. It focuses mainly, but not exclusively, on Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon in 1974. But it talks a bit about the history of pardons in America. And I'd like to just maybe give you a bit of an introduction to how pardons came about. Pardons are an anomaly in the American Constitution. As I think all of you probably remember from civics class and from just following the news, our Constitution is based on the separation of powers and the idea that there are checks and balances on each of the three branches of government. But pardons are different. Pardons are an anomaly in the respect that they are an absolute power of the President of the United States. There is no way that Congress can impose a pardon. They can't stop a pardon. And same thing with the courts. The courts can't initiate a pardon, and they can't stop one either. It is an sole and exclusive power of the president. And not surprisingly, in light of that, it is the part of the Constitution that comes most directly from the power of the King of Great Britain, who also had the power, similar pardon power in the 18th century. It is a monarchical power. There can be no check on it, and for that reason, if you look at American history, I think it operates like an X-ray into the souls of presidents because they can do whatever they want, and because they can do whatever they want, it tells you a lot about who they are and what they care about. Now, the pardon power came into the Constitution largely at the instigation of Alexander Hamilton. And the Constitution, as I'm sure you know, came about because the Articles of Confederation, which was how the American government was organized after the Revolution of 1776, wasn't working. And there was a thought on the part of the framers that they needed to, in effect, start over. So they all met in Philadelphia in 1787, and they wrote a constitution. And Alexander Hamilton was the leading exponent of the idea of a strong president. He thought there was no way the country was going to move forward unless there was a chief executive of the government. And he was under the Articles of Confederation. There was no president. I mean, there was in fact just the states. The Hamilton, advocated for a president, and including in the president's power, he thought it was important to have a pardon power, and he thought that was true for two reasons. One was he thought, and I'm sure this group will agree, that sometimes the criminal justice system operates in too cruel and sanguinary a fashion. Those were his words. He thought sometimes people got too rough a deal in the criminal justice system, even back in the 18th century, and he thought there was a need for a president, whom he assumed would be a wise figure, to be able to reduce sentences or eliminate them entirely. But there was a second reason, which was less obvious. The reason he thought presidents could use the pardon power to diffuse national crises, especially the issue of rebellions in the country. And there were, and in that time, that was more of a concern than it later turned out to be. In fact, under the first president, George Washington, there was something called the Whiskey Rebellion, which took place way out in the West, which meant Pennsylvania in those days. And it was essentially a tax revolt. But it was briefly violent, and Washington put it down, but he had a decision to make afterwards. How was he going to deal with the treasonous who rebelled? And what he did was he pardoned them, and he diffused the crisis in that way because there was no violent aftermath, and he used the pardon power just as Hamilton thought he would. Now, 60 years later, Abraham Lincoln used the pardon power in a much more consequential way. As the Civil War was ending, Lincoln was assassinated a few days before the end of the war, but as the war was ending, Lincoln decided that he was going to issue an amnesty, which was a group pardon in effect, to all the foot soldiers of the South as long as they pledged allegiance to the Union. And that was the most important demonstration of the second reason for the pardons by Hamilton. And again, it was very successful. The country didn't reintegrate easily, but certainly the effort to calm the waters after the Civil War with charity for all, with malice towards none, as Lincoln said in his second inaugural, was how he operated, and that set the stage for the reunification of the country. Now, after the Civil War, pardons became a bigger part of the American judicial system. There were a lot of pardons. Rutherford B. Hayes, a president you probably don't hear a lot about, issued 1,000 pardons, including to 11 people on death row, because there was just an understanding that this was something presidents were going to do. Pardons largely died out as a major force in the 1920s. Why? Because federal parole came in, the parole system came in, and so there was a different safety valve for getting people out of prison before their sentences had expired. Parole, as I'm sure you all know, parole doesn't exist in the federal system anymore, but supervised release does. The idea of parole has stuck in the criminal justice system, and it has really, at least in those days, lessened the pressure for pardons, and the number of pardons dropped off substantially. But I would like to tell you a story about my favorite pardon. My book has a lot of stories about bad pardons that shouldn't have been granted. But here's a story of a great pardon, and it involves another president you probably don't think about much, who's Warren Harding. Warren Harding was elected in 1920, a conservative Republican from Ohio, And one of the other candidates for president in 1920 was Eugene V. Debs, the great socialist leader who was really one of the major figures in American life throughout the early part of the 20th century. In an earlier presidential election, he got more than 1 million votes. He ran for president repeatedly. But during the Civil War, he was prosecuted for giving a speech advocating pacifism. It was, we would now say, a terrible violation of the First Amendment. The law of the First Amendment was not nearly as robust in those days, and he was thrown in prison for giving that speech at a picnic. And he ran for president repeatedly from prison and did remarkably well. When Harding took office, he was concerned about Debs. Harding was no socialist, but he recognized that he did not want to see Eugene Debs die in prison. So he did something extraordinary. He sent a message to Debs, who was in federal prison in Atlanta, and he said, "I want you to come to Washington and talk to my attorney general about your future." And this is a sign of how things were somewhat different in 1921. They let him out of prison for the day or for a couple of days, got on the train, went to Washington, met with the attorney general, got back on the train to Atlanta, and went back to prison. But just before Christmas in 1921, Warren Harding did pardon Eugene Debs. And the first thing Debs did was come to Washington at the invitation of Warren Harding. And Harding said, "I want to meet you, Mr. Debs." And Mr. Debs came to the White House and met Harding. And they certainly didn't agree on politics, but they shook hands in the Oval Office. And Harding welcomed Debs back to freedom. And he did not wind up dying in prison. One reason Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon in 1974 was so controversial and, in many respects, unpopular was that there hadn't been that many pardons since parole came in. It wasn't like the 19th century where pardons were sort of a regular part of American government. Nixon, the people were shocked, not just that Ford pardoned Nixon, but by pardons in general. Pardons, the idea of pardons was not really on the national agenda the way it is today, and the way it has been since 1974, because of the attention that Ford's pardon got. If you want to know more about Ford's pardon of Nixon, you can certainly read my book, and it's not really my purpose today to talk much about that pardon, but it certainly was what brought pardons back to national attention. Presidents started using the pardon power in much more high-profile ways after 1974. Jimmy Carter ran for president in 1976 with the promise that he would grant amnesty to all the Vietnam War resistors who moved to Canada rather than face the draft. It was about 50,000 people. And on his first day in office, that's what he did. It was controversial, but it wasn't that controversial because Ford had previewed that Carter had previewed that he was going to do it, and he did it. Ronald Reagan, in a high-profile act, pardoned 2 FBI agents who had been convicted of violating the rights of anti-war protesters, a sign that he was moving on past Watergate. Or at least that's what he thought. George Herbert Walker Bush, in his last days as president, pardoned the Iran-Contra defendants. For those of you who have very good memories, in the election of 1992, Lawrence Walsh, who was the independent counsel investigating the Iran-Contra affair, issued a superseding indictment of Caspar Weinberger a few days before the election, which mentioned Gerald Ford, and it got a lot of attention. And some people think it's one of the reasons Clinton beat Bush. Certainly, Bush was very resentful of Walsh's interjection into the campaign at the last minute, and that was one of the reasons he granted pardons after the election in his lame duck period to the other Iran-Contra defendants. Bill Clinton, in his last days in office, gave a series of pardons, some very, very controversial pardons. He pardoned his brother, who had been convicted of of a drug offense many years earlier. He was long out of prison. Most controversially, Clinton pardoned Mark Rich, who was a financier, a very wealthy guy who had been charged in a RICO case in the Southern District of New York. And instead of facing trial, he fled to Switzerland. He was a fugitive. He was, in fact, one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. And uh, Clinton pardoned him anyway, which I think was a really terrible thing to do, especially because Rich had never expressed any sort of contrition. He had never faced the charges, and there were allegations of some sort of corrupt deal. I don't think it was a corrupt deal. I think he did it because he was asked to do it by Ehud Barak, who was the prime minister of Israel, was very close to Clinton. They almost reached a big Middle Eastern deal in the last days of Clinton's presidency, and this was a favor to Barack. It wasn't any sort of corrupt deal, but it was really a stain on um, Clinton's Clinton's presidency. Ronald Reagan did not issue. I'm sorry. George W. Bush didn't like the pardon power at all. Didn't use it very much. One of the breaches between him and his vice president, Dick Cheney, was over Bush's refusal to give a pardon to Scooter Libby, who was an aide to Cheney, who was investigated for very misdeeds relating to a leak to the press. And it really poisoned their relationship. Bush commuted Libby's sentence, but he refused to give a pardon to Libby, and that really poisoned the relationship with Cheney. To this day, they are not close. Bush was really offended by, especially in the lame duck period, when he was asked on behalf of many friends to give pardons. And here's a story that I found very interesting. The one thing that George W. Bush and Barack Obama discussed in the limousine from the White House to the Capitol, where Obama was going to be sworn in, Obama said, Bush said, don't listen to all these people who are going to beg you for pardons. This is a corrupt process. This is, insiders trying to gain an advantage. Establish a pardon policy and stick to it early in your presidency. And it's interesting, out of all the things that George Bush could have talked about with Barack Obama in that limousine, the one thing he talked about was pardons and his offense at what he regarded as insiders trying to take advantage. And Obama, I think, took that advice to heart, perhaps too much to heart. For his first term and into his second, he almost granted very, very few pardons at all and very few commutations. But late in his presidency, he established something called the Clemency Project. And my friend Mark Osler, I know, is talking to you later, and he's the world's leading authority on this subject. It was basically an attempt to allow low-level offenders to go to the government and say, look, I've been a good prisoner. I was over sentenced, let me out, and it was fairly successful, I would say. I believe more than 1,000 people mostly got commutations rather than pardons, but I think it could have been a lot more successful, as Mark told me the story. I mean, there were incredibly complex levels of review that slowed down the clemency project, but it was certainly better than nothing. And it was characteristic of the Obama presidency, which was certainly an orderly one and not one that lent itself to wild swings or insider advantages. And that brings us to Donald Trump and my message to you today about pardons in the current moment. It is a deeply corrupt process. There effectively is no process. For many years, as I'm sure many of you know, there was something, and I guess there still is something called the Pardon Office in the Justice Department. And the Justice Department um, has an elaborate series of hoops for prospective pardon recipients to jump through. It's a very complicated application. It has a lot of rules. It has to be 5 years. You have to express contrition. You have to show you reformed. It has to be 5 years, I believe, since the end of your sentence. Uh, it's always been true that this was an advisory process. Presidents can pardon whoever they want, but the Pardon Office was established to create some sort of regularized process. Presidents didn't have to follow it. Some more than others did, but it was a cumbersome, slow-moving, very cautious process. It didn't work very well. But Trump, by and large, ignored it completely, and especially in the latter days of his first term, issued pardons based on who people knew. It was a completely insider-based process. There was a gold rush for pardons in the lame duck period after Trump lost the 2020 election, which he actually did lose. And when Joe Biden was inaugurated in January. Um, it it um, it largely functioned through Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law. He fielded requests from people who had connections to him or people who bought connections to him, and he um, dispensed and pardons were dispensed accordingly. Um, that led to Joe Biden. Biden issued a lot of symbolic pardons, like pardons to people who'd been convicted of marijuana offenses in federal court. They were mostly irrelevant because the convictions were long over. He issued pardons to people who had been convicted of LGBT offenses in the military, also, long in the past. Most notoriously, he pardoned his son after saying that he wouldn't do it. He also, on the very last day of his presidency, he pardoned several members of his own family, who were, as far as anyone and I know, were not even under investigation at the point. I think, sort of like the Mark Rich pardon with Clinton, the pardon of Hunter Biden certainly is a stain on Joe Biden's presidency. But that's certainly what he is known for. And again, Donald Trump returned to the presidency um, in this year, and the pardon process has accelerated, but it is accelerated in a similar way to the way it was conducted at the end of President Trump's first term. everything is personal with Trump and everything is transactional. He helps those who help him, and he punishes his enemies and rewards his friends. This is why Jim Comey and Tish James are under indictment, because they are his enemies. And this is why he has granted pardons. And, one thing I have to give President Trump a sort of perverse degree of credit for is that instead of bunching up his pardons in the lame duck period when he could face no political accountability, which is what presidents have done since Nixon, he is right out there issuing pardons from day one, and and taking the political consequences, if any. Most famously and most notoriously, he pardoned the 1,500 people who were arrested and prosecuted for the riot at the Capitol on January 6, 2021. I mean, I'm sure everyone who's listening here has their own opinions about that. My opinion of that was negative, especially those convictions for violent crimes against police officers. But Trump said he was going to pardon. He didn't specify during the campaign how extensive those January 6 pardons would be, but he certainly said he was going to pardon some people, and that's what he did on his first moment in office. But it's probably less known that he has continued this pattern of rewarding friends with pardons throughout his first year in his return to office. Um, for the anti-abortion movement, which is an important part of his political base, he gave pardons to 23 protesters who had been convicted of invading and blockading clinics. He's also become, as I'm sure you know, a big crypto guy in his second term, and he pardoned Ross Ulbricht, who was serving a life sentence for running an underground marketplace used by drug dealers. He played racial politics too. He pardoned 2 white police officers in the District of Columbia who had been convicted of murder and obstruction of justice in connection with their chase of a black suspect in 2020. The president nurtured his obsession with the Bidens by pardoning Devon Archer, who was a business partner of Hunter Biden and who had testified to Congress about what he said were misdeeds by the Biden family. Archer had been convicted in an unrelated scam in which he defrauded the pension funds of a Native American tribe for tens of millions of dollars. He didn't have to, as a result, he didn't have to serve his year-and-a-day sentence or pay millions of fines and restitution. Jason Galanis, who also testified against Hunter Biden, won a commutation of his 14-and-a-half-year sentence in connection with the same fraud scheme as Archer's. So President Trump has now created a kind of process for pardons, and it's led by 2 people. The first is Alice Johnson. Alice Johnson is called the Pardon Czar. She is an older African-American woman who was arrested in 1993 and convicted in 1996 of federal crimes related to a Memphis-based cocaine trafficking organization. She was convicted of money laundering and structuring, as well as the drug conspiracy. It apparently was a fairly extensive drug network, and she was sentenced to life in prison without parole in 1997. While she was in prison, she drew the attention of Kim Kardashian. I mean, you can't really make this stuff up. Kim Kardashian is actually a major figure in the history of criminal justice in America. And Kim Kardashian started posting on social media about Alice Johnson. Donald Trump likes celebrities. This drew his interest. He invited Kim Kardashian to the White House. They started talking. Not only did that lead to first a commutation and then a pardon for Alice Johnson after she spoke at the Republican convention in 2020, but it led to the First Step Act. which is, something the president doesn't like to talk about much because it's not really in keeping with his current political persona, but was really one of the major accomplishments of his first term. The First Step Act, as I suspect many of you know, it was uh, a very wide-ranging law that allowed certain people to lower their sentences. And it's been used extensively, and it remains on the books, and it is something that federal judges have been able to do to lower, I think we would all agree, unjust sentences in very profound ways. It's just it's a very good law. In his current tough on crime persona, the president doesn't like to talk about the First Step Act, but he did sign it, and it was a good thing. And I'm certainly glad it's on the books. So Alice Johnson is the pardon czar, but the pardon attorney in the Justice Department is Ed Martin. And Ed Martin is one of the least qualified lawyers ever to serve as a senior official in the Justice Department. He was never a prosecutor, but Trump named him the U.S. attorney in the District of Columbia. But he was so unqualified that even the Republican Senate wouldn't confirm him. So, as a sort of consolation prize, he was made the pardon attorney, but also the weaponization czar, and he is the person who's been pushing for the prosecution of Trump's political enemies, like Comey and Tish James. But he's also in charge of pardons. And this is a guy who is the ultimate loyalist to President Trump. He was he represented a number of the January 6 defendants, who he was briefly in charge of prosecuting as the DC acting U.S. attorney. But let me just conclude my message about pardons with this. If you want a pardon today, and I suspect there are people listening here who want a pardon today, what you need is a connection. You don't need the merits of your case. You need a connection. You need a connection to Alice Johnson. You need a connection or a connection to Ed Martin, or you need a connection to some other senior official close to President Trump. This is not a process about the merits. This is a process about who you know and who you can get your story in front of. I say that not as an endorsement. I don't think that's the way the pardon process should work. I don't think that's the way the government should work. But that's the way the government is working now. And if you are seeking a pardon now, you need a connection. Now, if you have a connection, it's no guarantee that you're going to get what you want, but you're not going to get what you want if you don't have a connection. So that's the cynical message I want to leave you with about pardons. As I said at the very beginning, the pardons are an X-rays into the soul of presidents. And the pardon process is an X-ray into the soul of Donald Trump. It is transactional. It is a reward for friends, and you better be a friend if you want that reward. So what is my second message? My second message is a much more hopeful one. Most of the people on this call, on this Zoom, you got in trouble. You did things wrong. You did things criminal, and you've paid a price. You probably paid a heavy price, maybe a too heavy a price. But here is something important to know. There are lots of people out there rooting for you. There is no better American story than the comeback. We see it in sports, we see it in entertainment, and we see it in what might be called the real world too. Of course, you have to live your life in a way that was different from the way that got you in trouble in the first place. You have to be clean in every sense of the word. But if you do, I think good things will happen. You will certainly feel better about yourselves. It's trite to say that virtue is its own reward, but sometimes it is. Many of you have seen the dark side of life, and you think it's a dark future. but it doesn't have to be that way. And lots of people will be rooting for you, and no one will be rooting for you harder than I am, and I will. And I just want to say good luck to all of you. Thank you for having me, and good luck for the rest of the conference.